Jonathan, the speech yesterday was about the economy, but as one would expect, it sort of drifted to all parts of what's happening in the presidential race, and pop culture was all over the place yesterday.
And trucks.
And trucks and cranes.
This is what the White House staff finds them facing time and time again. The president was supposed to deliver. This was not a campaign rally. This was supposed to be just an event on the economy, touting the work he has done for Pennsylvania. It suggested the manufacturing jobs he's returned to the state and so on, and it became a more than hour-long stem winder about every subject you just touched, including his love of cranes, where he thinks the presidential race is shaping up right now, and taking credit for the plant there that he was visiting, right. Suggesting that his administration was the impetus behind it there and creating jobs for Pennsylvania. The issue was that plant was given the go-ahead in 2012, which was not only President Barack Obama, but President Barack Obama's first term.
Right. Which is easily demonstrable. We're going to get more into the president's speech in Pennsylvania in just a moment, but we do want to begin with new information surrounding the jailhouse suicide of sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. A Justice Department official now tells NBC News that a team from the Bureau of Prisons will be at the Metropolitan Correctional Center today to examine what went wrong there. We're told protocol, whenever there is a significant event at a detention facility, calls for that move. Meanwhile, an administration official tells NBC News the FBI and DOJ Inspector General, which also are investigating the circumstances around Epstein's death, are being stymied by some federal employees who are, quote, lawyering up. This comes after yesterday's news that the warden at the federal lockup has been reassigned and 2 guards tasked with monitoring Epstein have been placed on leave. We're also learning more about one of the workers who was supposed to be guarding Epstein at the time. Yesterday, we reported the employee was not a full-time corrections officer. Now, a person familiar with the investigation tells NBC News that employee had been a corrections guard for 7 years. He then accepted a different job with better hours, but routinely took an overnight shift as a corrections officer to get overtime pay. The source would not say whether the employee was one of the 2 placed on administrative leave. Meanwhile, the New York Times is reporting the 2 staff members guarding Epstein's jail unit fell asleep and failed to check on him for about 3 hours, then falsified records to cover up that mistake. According to several law enforcement and prison officials with knowledge of the matter, 2 law enforcement officials telling NBC News investigators are looking at whether either or both of the employees on duty who were responsible for checking on Epstein were sleeping. They say no conclusion has yet been reached. Mike, this is unfathomable to people that at a facility like this, a federal jail that theoretically is a maximum security kind of place with that kind of a high-profile inmate, that the 2 guards could fall asleep like something out of a bad movie.
The 2 guards fell asleep, and then they falsified records indicating that they had checked on him every half hour, which clearly they had not. So they're in legal trouble right away. But one of the larger issues in here, though, Willie, is the warden himself at that prison, how he allowed, or how the warden allowed, Epstein to be in a cell by himself. Normally it is protocol. Anyone who has been on suicide watch has a cellmate. For various, obviously logical reasons, you know. I mean, you alert someone if someone tries to commit suicide in the cell with you. That cellmate was removed from the cell for inexplicable reasons, as yet to be explained, apparently about a week or 10 days ago, and Jeffrey Epstein was alone to do the deed.
There's also such reporting. There's reporting there that the staff is so overworked that there wasn't enough time between shifts, that the guards would be so tired that some of them would just sleep in their cars near the facility. Right. As opposed to then driving home and coming back.
And I think, you know, that accounts for perhaps the fact that they were not checking on him as often as they could have done, that some of the guards had fallen asleep, that then they felt bad, of course, so they went back and falsified the records. But it's what Mike is talking about that I think is leading rise to these conspiracy theories, because one thing if people are really tired and they do their job shoddily, another if it's made at a senior level the decision that you leave a prisoner alone, and that the cellmate was moved, as I understand it, just the night before. I mean, that's what's leading people to think this is just one coincidence too many, because it looks like a decision was made very consciously that would have put this prisoner in a position where he could do this, knowing that he'd already tried to do that.
Right, because he did have a roommate, a cellmate,
he had a
who had been transferred out. Exactly. President Trump is meanwhile defending his decision to promote an online conspiracy theory tying the Clintons to the death of Jeffrey Epstein.
He's a very highly respected conservative pundit it. He's a big Trump fan. That was a retweet. That wasn't from me. That was from him. But he's a man who has 500,000 followers, a lot of followers, and he's respected.
Do you really think the Clintons are involved in Jeffrey Epstein's death?
I have no idea. I know he was on his plane 27 times, and he said he was on the plane 4 times. But when they checked the plane log, Bill Clinton, who is a very good friend of Epstein, he was on the plane about 27 or 28 times. So why did he say 4 times? And then the question you have to ask is, did Bill Clinton go to the island? Because Epstein had an island that was not a good place, as I understand it, and I was never there. So you have to ask, did Bill Clinton go to the island? That's the question. If you find that out, you're going to know a lot.
So Rick Tyler, he promoted it once by retweeting it to his 63 million or so followers on Twitter and pouring gasoline on it yesterday, standing there in front of Marine One.
Well, it's just extraordinary. I mean, you have this suicide of a pedophile, a predator, who both Bill Clinton and Donald Trump were friends with, and Bill Clinton, Donald Trump, the president of the United States, decides that you know, his friend Bill Clinton was far worse than he was. See, I just went to a few parties with him, but he, after all, was on the plane 27 times, maybe 26 times, probably 27 times, and went to the island. You know, he went to the island. You got to ask him about the island. So it's just clear, you know, diversionary tactics. He thinks Jeffrey Epstein hurts him because there's a lot of pictures going around of them together. And, you know, he wants to change the narrative that the story's got to be all about Bill Clinton. It can't be about him.
Jonathan, he revels in this kind of thing, obviously. It plays to a certain audience. He likes talking about it, sort of this bizarre parlor game about who killed Jeffrey Epstein.
Right, and some of it is a distraction. The Clinton flight issue is one that we can and have fact-checked. The Clinton, Bill, the former president, was on Jeffrey Epstein's plane. It was 4 times, but those for long flights. So there are different legs to each flight, right. And that's where you get the number of 26 or whatever it may be. The Clintons have said strenuously that the former president never set foot on Jeffrey Epstein's private island. But this is what the president loves to do, and this is not a new phenomenon. He traffics in conspiracy theories, and we should never forget his entire political career is based on the back of the racist lie that was birtherism, suggesting that the first African-American president of the United States was ineligible for the position because he was actually not born here. That's what the president said. But it's time and time again. He thought that Ted Cruz's father may have killed President Kennedy. He suggested that Supreme Court Justice Anton Scalia may have been murdered. He thinks that wind farms cause cancer and that global warming is a Chinese hoax. He plays in these conspiracies, but what he also does is he likes to put it out there but never expect responsibility. He said time and time again, it's just a retweet. And he forgets that his words of the presidency carry weight.
And it's always involved him and how great he is. I mean, with the retweet. It's from a very well-respected guy. Right. He's got 500,000 followers, and he's a big Trump fan.
And he's a Trump
That's
man.
what he said.
Right. Jonathan, I mean, might be naive to think this at any point now, but is there anyone in the White House not saying to the president, because I don't think they're going to say it to the president.
No, but go ahead.
But is there anyone thinking this is not great to be taking on a former president like this? Even if they're not saying it to Donald Trump, are there people who are still thinking, who feel queasy about the president standing up there and going after President Clinton in this way?
I'll defer to Willie's answer there. It's no. No, the guardrails are gone. There's no one in the White House or in his immediate orbit who are going to get in the way of any sort of tweet. They've given up. They feel like that is separate to what happens.
It's kind of sense of hopelessness.
That's right.
And Yamiche, we've heard this time and again. I'm thinking about the Elijah Cummings week where he was tweeting about him, and the reports from inside the White House were of staffers sort of huddled in a room saying, are you going to tell him this is bad? Are you going to tell him? And ultimately, no one tells him.
The White House functions really as a place where people are trying to constantly decide how to deal with the president's tweets. It's not a place where anyone's trying to alter the president's behavior. They realize 2.5 years into his presidency that that's just not the way you survive and keep your job. All the aides I've been talking to always stress to me, if you really want to keep and be successful in the Trump White House, you have to just be constantly adjusting, constantly being willing to trip over yourself and contradict yourself as soon as the president comes out. I think that's also, I think, at times why we hear White White House aides saying one thing and then the president tweeting another, and no one wanting to go on record at times. Now, I can't say that White House aides also don't want to protect themselves, but there's this idea that they are fearful of going on record a lot of times because they know that one tweet can completely upend whatever the White House message was in the middle of the day. So I think the president, in some ways, has seen himself have success with the way he's done things, and he doesn't at all feel as though there's any reason to change that. And I think that goes back to what Jonathan was saying, this idea that he started his political career on a conspiracy theory and has been successful in doing that and hasn't really had to face any consequences.
And Jonathan, again, back to the internals of the White House, there's a track record here of anyone who speaks back to the president, anyone who says, hey, wait a minute, let's think about this. John Kelly, General Mattis, gone.
They fall out of favor, whether quickly or eventually. But there hasn't been anyone in there who's consistently been able to be a force to stand up to the president. His own daughter and son-in-law, they rarely do it. And we have seen time and time again, there was at least an effort there with Chief Kelly in particular, when he came into the chief of staff role, to try to rein the president in. And for a little while, the president was into it. But within a few weeks or months, he began to chafe. He threw off those shackles, and his replacement, Mick Mulvaney, the acting chief of staff, has said, "I'm not even going to try."
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.